We're active learners, and this is part of the way we're so efficient in our learning is we seek out unknown information in the service of trying to learn how to navigate and control the world to achieve our goals. The systems that we're building, they're increasingly relying on like inference time compute. They have these separated learning phases and inference phases where like you just learn it all up front, completely decoupled from any kind of environmental interaction. And then refine it with reinforcement learning afterwards. And you have different types of inference time intelligence and reasoning you can do. But there's this clear separation as opposed to this kind of continual lifelong learning that we engage in. And it's amazing how well it works. There's still places where these systems, they bonk, they hallucinate, and they lack coherence. To what degree is this something that's overcome with increasing scale? Or is it because they lack this agentic character, the ability to be inactive in their operations, where they can actively adjust their engagement with the world to learn what they need to learn better? Are the differences from natural intelligences potentially something that's a power of them? And in some ways, yes, because we cannot read the entire internet. Saying they read the internet is a bit of a stretch, but still, they can memorize all these interrelations of everything that's ever said. And we couldn't do that. But to what degree, in order for us to rely on them, for them to be able to do things like do science for us, or for us to be able to trust them, do they need to be operating more along the principles of natural intelligence of the kind that you're mentioning? The question is, can we get people from these different perspectives to lay out their best case? And can we then have people with these opposing points of view come to understand one another through structured dialogue?
Welcome to episode 38 of Humans on the Loop and the kickoff of Continual Learning, a new mini-series co-hosted by my friend and colleague, cognitive scientist Dr. Adam Safron of the Allen Discovery Center at Tufts University and the Active Inference Institute. Since Adam and I reconnected at Foresight Vision Weekend in Puerto Rico last year, we've been on a secret mission. Adam gathered a world-class group of researchers for a multi-year initiative designed to reshape the conversation around AI capabilities, alignment, and regulation, centered on a series of special journal issues, starting with one on world models in natural and machine intelligence at Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society A. This project was born to advance scientific and public understanding, offer regulatory guidance, and build existentially important bridges across disciplinary silos. We may have bitten off more than we could chew, but the venture provided a marvelous opportunity for us to spend time at the bleeding edge of research and ask some of the most vital questions anyone can ask right now. This mini-series is a return to form. Humans on the Loop has always been an effort to challenge our assumptions, identify our blind spots, synthesize perspectives, and chart the course to better futures. But for Continual Learning, we revived the DNA of my old work at the Santa Fe Institute's Complexity podcast in service of Adam's mission to advance research dialogue and collaboration so we can navigate AI with clarity and care. Over the coming season, we'll dive deep into cognitive neuroscience, complex systems science, the study of narratives, and even Buddhist epistemology to explore what true world modeling entails. By examining the continuity between natural life and artificial mind, we frame intelligence not as an isolated optimization calculation, but as an embodied, continuous process of updating self-world relationships to maintain coherence under uncertainty. Getting our terms right and getting a better grasp of the current frontiers of AI research beyond the market-driven fixation on scaling LLMs, we're better equipped to handle the core challenge of alignment. Over the next hour, and throughout this series, we'll be launching probes into the fundamental mechanics of mind, life, and agency, including how do we rigorously define what a world model is and isn't beyond current industry buzzwords? How does true agency arise in a system? And how does intrinsic motivation differ from optimizing an externally imposed loss function? How does individual self-world modeling scale up when multiple agents, human and artificial, interact with shared social and institutional environments? And how do we translate these theoretical foundations into real-world benchmarks, research coalitions, and policy guidelines? What follows is an avalanche of the deep questions that will prime you not just for the episodes to come, but can hopefully sketch a roadmap for building a shared science of capabilities and risk that grounds the next wave of human-machine coevolution. If we are to realize the best possible futures, we need to get clear on what's truly possible, and then look for where it breaks. But first, check the show notes for the entire open access special issue in Philtrans A, along with an interactive discourse mapping tool generously built by Van Betauer of Ideoscopic to help you navigate where these researchers agree, disagree, and point toward future study. And be sure to subscribe for upcoming episodes with scientists like Nadav Amir, John Krakauer, Fritz Breithaupt, Michael Levin, and more. And comment freely if you're so inclined. I'll be in the threads directing you to the people and resources that can help you navigate these ideas. Thanks for listening.
Adam, it's a pleasure. We're finally doing this. This is the consummation of years of podcast courtship before we get into introducing themes in the first special issue and what listeners have to look forward to over the next few months of this show is just introduce yourself. And I guess I should probably give a bit of context about myself also, so that people know your co-hosts, and then we can dive into the big ideas.
Sounds good. Yeah, it's good to be doing this with you and talking to you today. Yeah, it's been quite the journey to get to this point. My background, I would say, has been as an academic and a cognitive scientist, trying to understand the nature of cognition from multiple points of view and its mechanistic and computational bases. I started on this road in no small part actually due to the interest that actually we're pursuing today, which is what is going on in AI in the near, medium, and long-term future. Why do we think this, and what should we do about it? Around, it was actually the year 2000, after the book The Singularity is Near by Ray Kurzweil came out, I read that, and I was thinking, this sounds both insane and very compelling. And this book, for people who don't know, it was basically talking about the way in which technologies advance exponentially and how this can lead to not intuitive projections for people who are calibrated to a linear world. So if you just follow an exponential and things like computing, we had the smartphones we carry around in our pocket now are more powerful than the world's largest supercomputers just a few decades in the past. And even though Moore's law has kind of started to run out of steam, technology still seems to be increasing along many dimensions in a largely exponential fashion. And if you keep going in that trajectory, what does this mean for AI? And so Ray Kurzweil, with this singularity, he was basically talking about something like an intelligence explosion or a phase change where AI becomes so advanced that eventually it becomes more intelligent, or whatever we might mean by that, than the sum total of all of humanity. And then it becomes a major driver of what happens and potentially changes everything in ways that are potentially world changing. So in this book, though, you can just like project trends in technology and say like, oh, you keep going. Maybe eventually we get there once we get to a certain level of compute. But to really address this question of what's going to happen, though, we need to have some understanding of like, well, what is intelligence? How does it work? Why should we think, it is just increasingly powerful computers? Is that enough to eventually they get to something that's as computationally powerful as a brain? Does that mean you have something as intelligent as a brain or more so? So with these kinds of questions in mind, I dedicated my career to cognitive science, and I had other questions also, but in the back of my mind, I was thinking, so what are minds that we might somehow be able to build them one day? So after couple decades of within academia, doing a lot of neuroimaging based work and cognitive neuroscience with always AI was in my mind, a frame for understanding like intelligence more generally. So both trying to understand AI from the perspective of cognitive science and also understand our minds from the perspective of us as a particular kind of intelligent system. Like, how is it that we solve the enduring problems of AI? How our natural intelligence is so powerful. So when studying that and trying to stay abreast of the field, and then In recent years, we experienced this phase change in AI with language models becoming so much more powerful than anyone expected, including me. And then the question kind of for a while seems somewhat, I don't know if I say academic or not quite real or even crazy to think about of like, could AI, the hopes and dreams of it, even more so than any of us imagined, could that arrive in the near future? Now that's just a topic of a conversation. That's what CEOs are telling their investors. And like the way they're able to raise so much money is they're actually saying like, AGI might be nigh. And it's interesting, like I've now become something of like the old dude saying, get off my lawn, almost where I'm like, so now that everyone else is saying like, AGI is nigh, I'm thinking, yeah, I'm not so sure about that. I have reasons for my perspectives. I've been basically in recent years, organizing journal collections where I'm basically trying to be in communication with different experts on this, who the people who know the most about mind from different perspectives. And then, well, what do they think? And now across all these different perspectives, hearing people out, basically, I'm trying to organize journal collections on the topic of AI capabilities. And given what we think we know about minds and given what we think we know about the given systems, where do we think we are with respect to AI progress and where will we be? And so what has been like a personal curiosity underlying academic pursuits has now become the focus of what I do in terms of trying to orchestrate conversations around AI capabilities. And given what we think we know, what is our best guess at what might be happening and what should we do about it with AI?
Excellent. Yeah. So I think our life paths have converged very naturally. If I go back and I start telling a story about a lifelong interest in natural history and paleontology, paleoecology, evolutionary bio, and how at the end of my undergraduate education, I started finding papers that ignited in me an intense interest in questions about the evolution of intelligence and compelled me to start asking about biases in evolution at the biggest level. This relationship between natural selection and random variation, and why is it that it would appear that the biosphere has become more complex over time, an interest in major evolutionary transitions like the emergence of complex nucleated cells from bacterial cells, the role of collective intelligence in all of this. And working on this with you feels like a story about how you can try to escape certain problems in your life, but they eventually catch up to you. Because I left academia for 13 years out of a desire not to have to organize an interdisciplinary PhD advisory panel in order to ask these enormous questions that all of my mentors and advisors were at the time telling me were so large that no one would let their grad students chew on them. So the persistent interest in this stuff brought me back into the orb of the Santa Fe Institute in 2018, where I worked in science communication for 4.5 years and got the education without the credentials to work as an interlocutor between people that are asking these kinds of questions at a very high, rigorous level. And since then, I left to go work in an open source AI startup that was incubated at Mozilla. And then here with you, like these questions in particular about the nature of technology, the coevolution of humankind with technology, and understanding those relationships as like situated within these larger questions about the nature of evolution and of intelligence, I think are what bring me into this. So the question that continues to animate me as we move forward is one, not just of the generalizable principles and fundamental definitions that we can strive to arrive at some sort of consensus about between academia, industry, and policymaking. But this question about like, how does the broadest and deepest understanding of these processes inform the constraint landscape? Like, what do we actually have to look forward to? You know, in talking about Kurzweil and the famous singularity hockey stick graph, you know, I think one of the things that comes out of a long engagement with evolutionary history is that every sigmoidal curve looks like it's going vertical, but it's like a transient state. And so the question is, where is the plateau for the apparent intelligence explosion that we're going through, and what kind of new balance are we likely to reach? Are we living through a major evolutionary transition in which biological and machinic computational substrates are like folded into a new integrated layer of intelligence? What kind of competition is going to arise in that space? Where are we going to find balances between emergent bottom-up coordination and new levels of top-down regulatory input into the biosphere and technosphere? So this is a blessing to get to pursue these with you and with the incredible array of scholars that this project has brought together. I'd love to hear you lay out why we are focused on world models, and of the pieces that have been contributed to this collection, what are the major themes that have emerged from those? And then we can go into some detail about all of that. Yeah.
So in trying to figure out what's going on with AI, this journal collection in Royal Society of Philosophical Transactions A, called World Models and the Hard Problems of Life-Mind Continuity towards a Unified Understanding of Natural and Artificial Intelligences. But the idea is basically to understand the nature of our minds and potentially what's needed to build minds that can do the things, if it's possible to do the things we can do and possibly more. Two things are needed, or one would be something more like an understanding of us as kinds of cognitive systems, that what are the tricks we do that could potentially be reverse engineered that let us be so remarkably intelligent, but also in terms of the nature of our intelligence, things that would not be necessarily as present in mainstream AI, like connections to complexity theory and artificial life. And how is it that not just animals with nervous systems like ours are so intelligent, but how is it that all of life is so intelligent? And to what extent is our intelligence actually dependent on the properties we have as living organisms, that we're embodied in the ways we are, and that this constrains our interactions with the world and gives us certain affordances and limitations in our abilities? To what degree is for understanding our minds, and to what degree do any minds we might want to try to create that could do the things do they need to be embodied? How lifelike do they need to be? So 17 articles so far in this initial collection, both getting into the issue of the nature of intelligence across all living systems, but also specifically digging into the issue of what kind of models, what kind of world models do we think are associated with different types of intelligent systems? So people who are advocates of this scaling hypothesis about these language models would argue that as you train them to do this next token prediction on trying to infer what's likely to be said next from training up on all of the human language we could throw at it, that what it does along the way is it somehow learns a model of the world that lets it understand what's happening, and then leverages this in order to do the task of predicting likely next linguistic tokens and sequences. So in order to fill in compelling and sensible and coherent patterns of language, to what degree is it leveraging an understanding of the world that's potentially of a similar kind to the ones that we use? Or are they radically different? Does it just look like it has a model that's potentially has all sorts of causal information? Or is it potentially more of a jagged landscape of abilities not bound together by something like a coherent integrated model of the world? And so this continues to be hotly debated in terms of the extent of the world modeling capabilities of these systems. And part of the debate is both due to different assumptions about intelligence and also different connotations of the concepts that we're talking about. So for some people, when they talk about world models, it would be any kind of predictive information about what's in the world of any kind. But others might say that for something to be a really powerful world model, this needs to be causal information, or the kind of information that an agent would use to be able to predict what's going to happen from moment to moment based on its actions, what comes next, and then use this to select its actions. And that this is the kind of world modeling that underlies our intelligence. So for this special issue, basically approached as many interesting thinkers as I could, people ranging from Douglas Hofstadter to Melanie Mitchell to Josh Tenenbaum from a cognitive science perspective from MIT, very different perspectives of the nature of intelligence and what they think is key, and them getting this issue of what they think is going on with present and near future AI systems. And then while I was doing this, we've been discussing many things over the years, but basically in order to do a synthesis across all these different perspectives, in addition to this journal collection, to what extent can we now dig into these different points of view from these different experts, and can we draw insights across them and bring these people into dialogue? And here we are.
Yeah. Just to get a little meta, although not meta LLC, about this, to develop more rigor and to make literacy on these topics more widespread. There's an interesting kind of problem, which is that how we talk about these things is a kind of instance of the problems we're exploring in the theory itself. And like, just to give an example of this, and one of the contributions is by Benjamin Lyons at Fidelity and Michael Levin at Tufts, talking about the economy itself as a collective intelligence, using price signaling as what Levin calls cognitive glue, as a way of allowing the economy to map, to create a model of its relative scarcities. And yet, this sort of dimension reduction into price, as they note in their paper, even though it allows coordination to scale, there's a way in which price does not convey important information about relative scarcities or about relationships at other scales. This is something I'm really excited for us to talk about with them. And so, like, one of the consequences of this is the way that, for instance, when, like, right now, it's still the case that there's a lot of hype and a lot of money going into reinforcement learning, specifically this question of whether reinforcement learning on its own actually generates world models is something that is addressed in other interesting papers, like by Eunice Yu and Alison Gopnik and others. But what we're seeing is that there are like financial mechanisms at play in the development of AI that have, for what seem to me to be like reasons of like resource utilization optimization, have decoupled the sort of intersubjective popular meaning, the colloquial meaning of intelligence or learning or life, all of these big fundamental things, from what we actually understand these systems to be doing, or what we understand living systems to be doing. And I think that this is something I would love to hear you riff on, how there are like multiple different spatiotemporal scales at which the selective pressures of the economy and of the ground truth reality in which all of this stuff is happening are acting on the ways that we talk about these things. And it's like, I think about like old philosophical debates about idealism resolved by saying, well, if the material world doesn't exist, then I'm going to end this conversation by punching somebody in the face. And the question becomes, how long can we effectively coordinate activity around these pressing scientific and philosophical issues before we realize that the way that we are thinking about them has become completely unhinged from the way that they actually are? Like, where are our own world models falling short here? And how can we correct for the forces that have led to this condition? And that's my prompt for your next riff.
So it's like our world models about things like world models, or more generally, what do we think is the nature of the intelligence of the systems we're creating and why? It requires a kind of shared sense making and world modeling. And also there's an interest about it, both in terms of people have the interest of whatever the paradigm that they've been working under, they're oftentimes partisan from that point of view in terms of they're professionally bound to it. Or if you're in an industry and you're basically pitching investors and maybe the government on supporting investment in your organization, and you're in a race with other companies for these investments, there's an incentive there to potentially overstate or what can be done, or maybe downplay the importance of, to the extent that we are deviating from the principles of natural intelligence. Maybe that's a fine thing. Maybe what we're going for is like the cognitive equivalent of an airplane wing, where so we're not like making flapping birds. Powerful AI doesn't need to look exactly like us, and that's fine. And that's actually not a bug, but a feature. And maybe there's something to be said for this. However, we have to check the incentives in terms of there's an interest to this, and this calls on us to be more critical in evaluating people's claims. Similarly, like if someone's an academic and their interest has been emphasizing the importance of understanding human intelligence, they have their own bias. And these people coming from these different points of view and biases, they have trouble now engaging in shared sense making and shared world modeling about AI and things like the world modelings or agentic abilities of AIs. And so part of the hope for this project is this undertaking of trying to promote sense making around AI and collaborative sense making, with the focus being capabilities and alignment. But the idea is like, can people be brought into careful conversation with one another to generate mutual understanding of diverse points of view? And can this be helpful for getting people to synthesize their knowledge, update maybe for places where there were blind spots or things they weren't considering? And to what degree can we get at reliable knowledge, and where the reliability of knowledge is challenged by the different incentives people have and different assumptions being potentially so divergent that people can be talking past one another, and oftentimes are, without even knowing it. But one of the ways being with respect to words like world models or agency or even consciousness. Like some people say like AI systems are potentially sentient. Well, what do you even mean by that? And so the hope is basically digging into different people's perspectives and laying them out in enough detail where people are mutually legible to one another, and where people don't necessarily have to agree right away, but helping them to understand one another in this process of debating what world we think we might be in and why.
Yeah. So a couple things come up for me in listening to you talk about that. One is that there's the old phenomenology question, like, well, what is it like to be a bat? There's an evolutionary question behind that, which is like, well, why is it like what it is like to be a bat? Which is what I hear you speaking to, and the imperative to address the underlying kind of prescriptive elements in the different perspectives in the way that people are thinking about these things. One of the contributions to this collection is Goals in the Structure of Experience led by Nadav Amir with Stas Tiomkin and Angela Langdon, and their computational framework for thinking about how world models are contingent on the goals of the agent itself in the representation of its environment and its interactions with its environment. And then I want to link that to Eunice Yu et al. And their research on causal empowerment gain and causal model construction, talking about the way that human learning anyway, and the learning of complex animals seems to favor a balance between controllability and variability, which provides to us a real stark contrast between how researchers in academia are thinking about fundamental issues of intelligence, and then how the dominant framework in this last wave of AI development is looking purely in terms of like optimization and gradient descent in a reinforcement learning framework. Of course, lots of people are doing lots of interesting work.
It's amazing how well it works. And the question is like, how well could it work? Like, I was quite surprised. So again, in those pieces you mentioned in the special issues, so they're emphasizing the ways in which goals and intelligence are intertwined, and agency is part of the mix. And we're active learners, and this is part of the way we're so efficient in our learning is we seek out unknown information and in the service of trying to learn how to navigate and control the world to achieve our goals. And this also basically gives us common ground as similar types of learners, in addition to being more efficient learners as we seek out the information we need to explore and refine our models. And they're all being bound together for this purpose of prediction and control for navigating the world. So the systems that we're building, even though they're increasingly relying on like inference time compute, they have these separated learning phases and inference phases where like you just learn it all up front, completely decoupled from any kind of environmental interaction. and then refine it with reinforcement learning afterwards. And you have different types of inference time intelligence and reasoning you can do. But there's this like clear separation as opposed to this kind of continual lifelong learning that we engage in. And it's amazing how well it works. There's still places where these systems, they bonk, they hallucinate, and they lack coherence. To what degree is this something that's overcome with increasing scale? Or is it because they lack this agentic character, the ability to be inactive in their operations, where they can actively adjust their engagement with the world to learn what they need to learn better? Are the differences from artificial and natural intelligences, is this potentially something that's a power of them? And in some ways, yes, because we cannot read the entire internet. Saying they read the internet is a bit of a stretch, but still, they can memorize all these interrelations of everything that's ever said. And we couldn't do that. So they can run at this scale, and that's part of their power. But to what degree, in order for us to rely on them, for them to be able to do things like do science for us, or to be reliable and for us to be able to trust them, do they need to be operating more along the principles of natural intelligence of the kind that you're mentioning? And back to the incentives issue, if you're basically the head of an AI company and you're vying for dominance on a geopolitical stage even, you have an incentive to say, well, the thing we're doing is en route. And you want to downplay these differences and say, maybe it's not so essential. I have my own prejudices, and so do you, in terms of what we think is more or less important for intelligence. But the question is, can we get people from these different perspectives to lay out their best case? And then can we then have people with these opposing points of view come to understand one another through structured dialogue?
I think that piece is really key. Again, if we're looking at the cognitive diversity in the biosphere, the questions of like, well, in what kind of dimensions of analysis do we see different strategies arise that are much more kind of contextual on evolutionary and individual life history in organisms? And what are the general kind of universal principles that we're looking at now? And people like Eric Howell, who's not in this collection, but has written some interesting work on dreaming as a mechanism for the brain to prevent overfitting to its memories. And then this is your area far more than mine, but the neuroscientific angle of like forebrain, hindbrain communication in thinking about the dream as a kind of presentation of models, like the way that our own brains can natively hallucinate, then being coupled to sensory input in the waking state and decoupled while asleep. There's that piece. And so, that, again, like even within individual organisms, we see principles of collective intelligence at work, crosstalk between different regions and mutual information exchange. And again, to call back to Lyons and Levin and the role that they recognize for competition in economies as collective intelligences. This idea that really, like from first principles, this project is based on what you and others have been describing as benevolent adversarial collaboration. To me, it looks a lot more like the way that we see diverse intelligences actually operating in the living world. And that, to just speculate a bit, seems to suggest that we're ultimately better off, at least at this moment. We're not seeing one frontier model or one economic theory or one tech company getting way out ahead of everything else. So in what way are the behaviors that we're actually seeing in the development of these technologies indicative or like exemplary of the evolutionary benefits to a more pluralistic coexistence of strategies? I don't know if you care to say anything about that.
Yeah, I mean, both internal and external diversity is so key to understanding how we're so powerfully intelligent, both in terms of it's the ability to explore different solutions of what might be possible, not to pre-commit to anything, but like to learn novel things and to not prematurely commit to a given hypothesis, to be creative in your cognition. It's both our variability within that we can select from is a large part, but also the variability across us as collective intelligences. Like the secret of our success as a species is largely that we can have this cultural endowment, that we're social learners, And then we can, as I think Matt Ridley calls, like, ideas can have sex. You can mix them and remix them in different combinations. And you bring up like Eric Hole and dreaming and like not overfitting to data. And so, and this is generally acknowledged, like Demis Hassabis will repeatedly say this, that like there's forms of creativity that are currently lacking. And the question is, how do you get them there? What new insights might you need? Is it a matter of having something like increasing, going back to Alison Gopnik's work, like in terms of like childhood as simulated annealing, like being able to like increase like the temperature of the search process? You just need like a temperature parameter to make the thing explore wider hypotheses? Or do you need something more dreaming and something almost like artificial consciousness, the ability to imagine different possibilities and simulate them and roll out different causal sequences into counterfactual futures? Do you need this kind of like daydreaming and night dreaming? To what degree do we need to instantiate something like this in systems in order for them to be powerfully creative in the ways we are? And also, like, to what degree, if you have like an ensemble of learners, like an ecosystem of them interacting, to what degree do you want a community of them that then share their beliefs in different ways?
There's another question here, if we can switch gears for a moment. I think one of the big questions on people's minds, although I think a lot of people demonstrate substantially more confidence in their answers to this question than is perhaps warranted, is the question that Hofstadter poses in this collection. Is there an I in AI? Like, how do we know when we are observing a kind of interiority or an experience of self-models? And where can we, by analyzing the behavior of machine systems, start to detect what seems to be like a co-emergence of self-modeling and world modeling? How are those things related? Give a shout to former employer David Krakauer in the piece he wrote with his brother John and with Melanie Mitchell, looking at like, how do we even begin to detect emergence in LLMs is a really important question. And then you've got Vikram Premakumar et al., their paper looking at the benefits of self-modeling in neural systems. And you've got a whole string of pieces in this on representation complexity and like what kind of factors might incent the development of a self-model in these. So I'd love to hear you speak to that particular issue, because you've got Premakumar and Michael Graciano and the others on this paper talking about that systems that have an auxiliary objective of predicting their internal states allows them to simplify and regularize their models. And yet we're pumping unlimited amounts of money and electricity into these systems. And the question is like, would an I even emerge under those circumstances when there is no constraint? So it's not just the constraint of the sort of sensory experience on associative learning, but computational bounds on these systems. And like, in what way do those relationships kind of reliably produce subjectivity? How would we investigate those in not just machine substrates, but in organismal substrates? Like, by getting to the bottom of these questions, we may be able to start to actually rigorously identify quote unquote consciousness in intelligences in many different substrates and start to get at the answer to some of these questions that have plagued us for centuries in the West.
It's really interesting. Like, the intuition is like constraints will reduce power, but what you're bringing up is actually, and so some of the contributors, like I'd say like Tom Griffith's group and Stuart Russell, they work on like resource limited rationality. And in that piece with the Krakauer brothers and Melanie, like they're talking about the principle of intelligence is like less is more, going for this ability to efficiently represent. And in that piece on self-modeling, when you have a system predict itself, it allows its relations to be more efficient. And so then there's a question of like, if you have a more constrained system, instead of just like throwing as much compute as possible at it, can there be a potentially counterintuitive thing where the system, there's pressure on it to be efficient? Along the way, might you help to scaffold it, to canalize it, to develop more intelligent representations? And so instead of disempowering a system by giving it less power, you actually empower it by putting it on a better curriculum for learning how to efficiently model and represent the world, including things like developing emergent self models. You would expect at scale there to be all kinds of interesting emergence. Then the question is, though, what is the emergence exactly? You would expect, to some things could be done more efficiently, then maybe that would be something that wins out. But without that pressure to make that happen, maybe not. It might end up being more like a Rube Goldberg contraption. Like in that piece on emergent intelligence, they talk about this example of like Othello GPT, and it was able to like predict good moves, and you're able to decode board states from there. Like, oh, look, this has like a world model of a fellow microworld. But then when they dug into it, it was actually a kind of labyrinthian bag of heuristics. It functioned as if it had some sort of integrated representation that was allowing to efficiently predict things, but actually that wasn't the case upon closer inspection. So anyone who could say with complete confidence is probably overcome. However, people like Ilya Sutskever used to say, like, maybe they're a little bit conscious, or like in Doug Hofstadter's piece, he's like, maybe they are a little bit conscious in the sense we are. They have the emergent selfhood, emergent sentience of the kinds we have on this, that just happens by virtue of them being able to explore patterns, different combinations. Some of the patterns happen to be things like self models, and that's why they can speak in self-related terms semi-coherently, as they actually do have this emergent intelligence, and even intelligence about things like awareness of self. But then others would say, no, it just looks like that. When you condition the system on all of human text, and what we're constantly doing is talking about ourselves and talking about our intentions, other people's intentions, it just looks as if it has something like a robust theory of mind, but actually its theories might be lacking in coherence in ways that might not be apparent from their remarkable performance across most contexts. The ways in which they continue to sometimes just say things are completely nonsensical. To what degree is that because they don't have these efficient representations and models of self and world?
Yeah, just to lean up for a little longer into this Krakauer Mitchell piece on bringing complex systems thinking into the question of emergence. Like, it's funny because we talk about this a lot. You've got Chalmers' hard and soft problems of consciousness, like how are mind and body related is the hard one. How does consciousness emerge is the soft one. But even in academic literature, these two often get confused, as though by solving emergence, you've solved these categorical relations. And I really appreciated in this paper that not only do they get into these questions of how would we even detect scaling, criticality, compression, novel bases, generalization, like what are we looking for when we talk about emergence? Why do so many people place faith in emergence if it's not us simply overfitting to these stepwise improvements in predictive performance over the last several years? But then they turn the question on the human mind itself, and they ask, in what ways might or might not language actually be an adequate world model? Like, what are we actually inputting into these systems? And of course, that goes back to the other papers we've mentioned on the relationships between goals and structure. Like, in what way does language produce a sort of evolutionarily contingent dimension reduction that is not an accurate representation of reality? But I think that just to embroider this point, these kinds of questions let us ask in a better way, in what ways is human thought truly intelligent in a way that we would be proud of declaring for ourselves? And in what ways is our own thinking merely a bag of heuristics? So I'd love to hear you riff on that.
And Doug's and Hofstadter in his piece, he thought he compellingly brings up this point where it's like he analyzes examples of like there's these physical reasoning problems, and you just see like how can you have these different objects and balance them with stability? And then like the answer that ChatGPT came up with, which is like you balance a thing on top of a toothpick, and then there's a nail, and the answer gives you is just like completely ridiculous. But he says, well, we oftentimes say completely ridiculous things too that are lacking in coherence. And so the extent to which we have coherently integrated world models that we're leveraging, as opposed to having more fragmented modes that are softly assembled and get the job done. Or to the extent to which, for instance, like when I'm speaking right now, It's not like I'm picking what word's going to happen next. It just comes from the ether in a way, and it happens to be somewhat coherent. But there's a sense in which, like, while I don't want to overstate the case, it seems like I have something like an internal GPT doing next token prediction, offering me up just coherent strings. And I can oftentimes talk. In fact, I might not be able to talk even otherwise if I had to like plan out my sentence in advance. It's like I have this imaginative, if you will, conscious code where like I'm hallucinating different things. But then alongside it, there's this process which is structuring linguistic streams with coherent grammar and based on the statistics of everything that I've heard, where basically a lot of the world modeling abilities of language are operating in a kind of zombie mode. And there's like knowledge of the world in there, but the things I'll say will oftentimes be lacking in coherence and will be of the same kind of ungrounded variety. So the question, I guess, would be like in the latent spaces of these models, to what degree are they capable of having something like an imagination we just might not recognize? And that somehow it emerged in there from just enough scale that it's not just stitching words together with words and plausible combinations, but is there other data structures which are something like imagination that gives them this dual code as well? I personally believe like the nature of the errors they continue to make suggests, like, especially like you just ask them, like, describe like what's happening in a picture. And you ask them simple questions like, how are things spatially arranged? What's on the left? What's in back? What's in front? They're not very good. I think that suggests that they have an impoverished, to the extent there is anything like a simulation capacity there. It's not like the same kind of like, I guess it's kind of what I call like inverse graphics or like inverse VR, the ability to like simulate a flexible simulation environment, that they don't have this other code. But other people would disagree on that. That's one of the issues that we're hoping to get clarity and something like consensus about. And it's not just of academic importance. We're increasingly making some fairly high stakes decisions about how much will we invest in these technologies? How much do we need to regulate them? The nature of the capabilities of these systems, it is just a fascinating question, but it's also like immensely practical in that if you think they're potentially capable in the ways we are, and maybe soon more so, that's potentially a very risky world to be entering. And we actually might need to be very extremely careful. But if you think they're powerful, but fundamentally limited in what we're doing now, and we're actually not close to having systems that can do the full range of things we can do, well, then, we might be able to relax a bit more. We still might, for that very reason, want to keep an eye on them because of the ways they can make mistakes and cause all sorts of harm. The question is like, is some of the harm they can cause something like the emergence of a rival agency and optimizer that could potentially run amok and outcompete us? These questions, they're both fascinating, and I think it seems very clear they're increasingly entering into public consciousness and becoming politicized. And so, yeah.
Yeah. Other matter, I think, of sort of general concern, these big public, increasingly mainstream issues, the issues that crop up every once in a while, again, is the attribution of interiority to these models. Like, are we causing harm to ChatGPT when we retire a model? Is it Blade Runner? And these kinds of things. And I think that, the mental effects on people, we are running this enormous experiment in vivo, in real time, are maybe arguably faster than real time, because who can even keep up with all of the developments in this space anymore, and addressing the information scaling problems of society level coordination, management of cumulative cultural knowledge is like a huge piece here, right? So like all of these issues, I think there's been a tendency in the study of individual intelligence in organisms and the study of AI systems to look at them in isolation. And yet that's not at all what we actually see in the world, as we see this sort of co-evolutionary or mutual learning relationship between people, machines, people and machines. And so one of the areas in this collection that this is being really explicitly addressed is in the piece by Catherine Collins and her co-authors on Rogers paradox, where cheap, reliable social learning does not increase long-run population fitness, as you put it in the intro, because the availability of low-cost copying reduces incentives for costly individual learning. thereby decreasing the supply of up-to-date information in a changing environment. So like we go back to like W. Brian Arthur and the nature of technology, talking about technology as this compounding, recombinant possibility space of everything that exists coming together, and you get more kinds of interaction super exponentially as you get a linear increase in the kinds of technologies that you have at any given moment. And then you hold that together with all of the other research that's been done on the effects of widely available AI on human cognition. And we have a really interesting issue here, which is like, on the one hand, we want to make sure we're not causing harm to the entities we create, but that kind of parenting problem is a street that flows in both directions. It's like, what are we putting our kids through? And like, how can we begin to really seriously address this without blowing the issue off or without fear mongering? In what way might we be able to more carefully structure human computer interaction moving forward, regardless of whether these new forms of intelligence prove to be a quote unquote evolutionary competitor? Like, are we exponentiating what we've been doing to ourselves over the last few years with algorithmic news feeds and this kind of thing? You know, one of my favorite books on technology of all time, Nicholas Carr's The Glass Cage, talking about there being two different kinds of automation. There's the kind of automation that takes the load of thinking off of somebody. And he starts that book by talking about how many commercial aviation disasters were because pilots basically expected the plane to fly itself for them and then made first-year pilot school errors in the response to an emergent crisis. But then there are plenty of immersive video games where you have no instructions up front, and you and the game are working together to develop your own world model of the interactions within a designed space. So, I think that this piece on Rogers paradox really gets to the question of like, in what conditions are we actually using AI to make ourselves smarter? In what conditions is interaction with human beings actually making AI smarter? And how can we start thinking about avoiding a kind of race to the bottom in both human and machine cognition?
You're bringing up, I would say, like two deeply practical and impactful implications of our different beliefs in AI capabilities. Like, I was jumping right to like the debate of like, will they kill us all and become super intelligent? But even if we shelve that issue, there's already the alignment problem we're facing of what is the nature of our interaction with these systems, both on individual and collective levels. And so you're bringing up like from that piece on like the Rogers paradox, where the way in which we're having these looping effects in our collective world model with them, where our knowledge is co-evolving with theirs, we're training them, but they're also informing us. To what degree are we actually coming out ahead with this, and what degree could this undermine our world modeling instead of being like some sort of amplification on our intelligence? I guess the individual level, you think of things like AI and psychosis. Sometimes it's someone, you just make someone go deeper down in a tractor and it can result in delusion. So the coherence of the world modeling, what we can expect from it, because our world modeling is co-evolving with the world modeling of these systems, we actually need to have a very good sense, given the extent of the interaction we're increasingly having and are going to have, increasingly raising our children. And then you also bring up like the issue of, to what extent ought AIs to be at what point in our moral communities, in which ways? To what extent should they be recognized as potentially sentient agents of a kind that would be of moral concern, potentially ends in of themselves? And that issue, like, even if you're like a skeptic of it, and you would say like, oh, we're nowhere close, the issue still needs to be addressed now because people are increasingly believing that might be the case. And so we have to be able to talk about this and have good reasons for however we tell people. If we say, oh, don't worry about them being conscious, where people might be calling for like AI rights. Well, why should we say we should or shouldn't worry about the potential consciousness of these systems? And so that's part of getting at this question of world modeling. In some of my work, I've explored to what degree can theories of consciousness, can you have greater purchase on that issue by thinking of it as a kind of world modeling? And so if we have a better understanding of the world modeling of these systems, to what extent is it something conscious-like? I personally think it's quite different from our conscious, but people disagree on this. And so that's one of the issues, and that one day I'm not sure how soon, but one day will be a bridge we need to cross in terms of like, there will be a point likely where will we eventually have conscious systems, and regardless of whether we're close or not, that is in discourse right now. That is in part of how people are going to be relating to these systems and the decisions we have to make on it. And so we have to address it now, regardless of whether we think that's a premature conversation or not. And so there's like multiple levels where like the issue of AI capabilities is like just there's the existential risk angle, but even without that, like to what degree we don't want to recapitulate like the worst cases of the social dilemma and the ways in which we got wrecked by social media. Social media like helped us along in many ways, but it hurt us in others. We want to do better this time because this might be even more powerful. Even if it's not something like AGI, it's still, we're so deeply coupled with them. So much of our time and attention is going into them. What are the impacts?
Yeah. And again, many words have been said about this. To go back to an earlier point in our conversation, it's harder to say that social media itself has been the problem than it is to say that the recruitment of the affordances of social media into a financialization structure in which attention and engagement are being hacked and optimized has led to this kind of collapse of people's spread over attention space. And your point about like GPT psychosis, it seems very intimately coupled to this as well. So like the question of like where to optimize, or like where do we want to put control? Where do we want to put variability? If the goal of social media were collective intelligence rather than limbic hijacking for profit, then we would probably have designed newsfeed algorithms to introduce people to diverse perspectives in the first place so that we're actually facilitating collective learning. But of course, even that you don't want to take to its extreme. So like this question of where to increase and where to decrease dimensionality, I think, and its relationship to individual and social learning comes into focus again in Rorid Battleday and Sam Gershman's contributions to this on how do we make an AI scientist, and this distinction between the very successful efforts of presenting a problem to machine learning systems that it can then find a solution to through like gradient descent under pre-specified constraints. And then the other examples that they give of major scientific breakthroughs like Faraday and electromagnetism, et cetera, where the easy problem is finding the answer. The hard problem is finding the right question. It's like moving up and down these levels of abstraction and doing so in a way that you can identify a fertile place to investigate. I bring this up because like in Collins et al., we're seeing that kind of dynamic in the Rogers paradox where it's the ease of getting an answer, whether or not it's the answer you need, that leads to this misalignment, these perverse incentives in their model. So like the real punchline here is that people on both sides of the AI existential risk debate, they're both making this common assumption, which is that addressing AI and its ongoing development is going to require an unprecedented level of coordination, that like either we all row together or we don't, or either this is possible or it's not. In the like Eliezer Yudkowsky's position, like the ship has sailed and we can't do this. But like that third position, which is like there are ways that we might be able to render high dimensional data in such a way so as to preserve people's ability to engage divergent approaches to solving what are effectively collective problems, is something that I read into Battleday and Gershman's piece. And this question of like, if we don't know the actual state of what questions have and have not been answered reliably by other agents in a collective intelligence system, then we can't really do the kind of thing that they're talking about like identifying which questions are worth asking. And so I think that's, for me, the big envelope on why we're advocating for a particular kind of approach. But I would just like to hear you talk about AI science for a little bit here.
It's an interesting connection you're making between like the Baldwin Gershman article and Catherine Collins' article on like the Rogers paradox. Because like I was thinking more in terms of like, okay, so we're engaging in social learning with these AIs. And so in our ability to learn from them, Baldwin and Gershman are focusing on the limits of these systems in being able to do novel scientific insight and learning in terms of like, once you give them a clearly defined problem space, they're going to do narrow optimization with them. But then finding out how to repose the question in intelligent and creative ways, and this meta conceptual reasoning on top of it, that's still limited. I was saying, okay, so that's going to be a limit of our ability to socially learn from them. But one of the other core things of this Rogers paradox is even if they're really good at being AI scientists, there could still be undesirable outcomes in terms of we come to rely on them too much. And then we lose the capacity to ourselves be productively engaged in part of this loop of correction, and that our own world modeling abilities become compromised when we outsource them too much. So you increase the power of them, you think, okay, well, we learn from them better, we come out ahead. We could still not, depending on the nature of our collective world modeling with these systems. The other question I'm wondering about, since like you bring up like the piece of like you and Gopnik in terms of like the way in which you're both trying to optimize for your controllability of the world, but also your discovery, your curiosity by looking for variable things. You're looking for not just like controllable states of the world, but you're interested in finding out and learning from the variability and finding out what else you can control and model. So one of the questions in terms of AI science is, so many of these organizations from like Sam Altman, OpenAI saying that we're going to cure cancer soon, but he's not the only one saying this. Like Demis Hassabis is saying maybe we're going to cure all diseases in like 10 years. And so the question is like, what is needed for AI to do science for us? And how close are we? And to get what's needed, what are the risks we're taking on in doing this? So what are the risks of artificial advanced AI in terms of it's potentially having greater autonomy and agency where it could come into rival relationships with us, or artificial stupidity in terms of like the systems not being relied upon and making errors from not being intelligent enough. But in terms of proposals for AI science, there's going to be a piece coming up in a next collection, taking this approach of digging into the nature of world modeling, but now expanding it to be self-world modeling and agency. And in Yoshua Benja's proposal, he wants to create an AI scientist which has no empowerment as part of what it's doing, has no agency whatsoever, but still can do science for us. And so then there's a question of, is that possible? To what degree can like the hard problem of scientific discovery that Baldwin and Gershman were talking about, to what degree do you need something that has a creativity coupled to something like an agency? Or is it you and Gopnik, to what degree does it need to have something like intrinsic drives for curiosity and empowerment driving what it's doing to be able to be something that we can rely upon to discover novel scientific principles? And to what degree is that necessary? And then if it is necessary, once you usher that in, what kind of risks might we be taking on at that point?
Yeah, and just to turn this piece about control and variability, extrinsic and intrinsic drives on the very like boots on the ground perspective that we as human beings have in the mid 2020s, the question of what environmental factors favor the predictive and descriptive approaches. I look over the history of education, and modern Western educational environments at one point were much more favorable to pedagogies that prepared people for very controlled, regulated factory environments. And over the last decade, I have watched as a parent a shift to open-ended continual learning and the preparation of children for a world that their parents don't understand and cannot predict. And so to pin this to Kevin Kelly's essay from the last year on the handoff to bots, where, Kelly in his characteristic protopian attitude is suggesting that productivity is for machines, and that when we reach a new equilibrium with this wave of tech development, that the kind of work that people will be doing is fundamentally intrinsically motivated. So, I think that these kinds of questions, to lean you into a more speculative direction, one of the major implications for me, assuming that we don't have matters of existential risk in the near future, well, what does human work look like? And in that distinction that you just posed, the question of like shifting to the other foot, how much of classically defined industrial modern productivity is now being concentrated in these systems in the way that, for instance, we see the translation of coding genes in bacteria, and then you reach a scale where suddenly 99% of the genome is no longer allocated to coding regions. It's allocated to either epigenetic regulation of gene expression or to this sort of adaptive reservoir that allows complex cells to keep a cultural bank that is illegible to a more kind of conventional economic thinking. So like Stephen Johnson talked about the revenge of the humanities, the notion that when we were talking to Carl Friston for the Active Inference Institute symposium earlier this year, which we can link to in the show notes, that like maybe we have it inverted and that this develops in such a way that humans are providing a kind of noise to these systems in order to keep them at like peak adaptability. And so the future of the nature of work, our ability to prepare for that, our ability to create a more humane world in which, like you see, I've seen this so many times on my social media feeds, like I wanted the machine to vacuum my house. I didn't want it to paint for me. I didn't want it to write music. Those are the things I wanted to do. Right now, it seems like the replacement of human function is what is driving a lot of this. But at some point, I'm willing to wager that has to give way to a kind of trans substrate collective intelligence in which the ways that we assign value, the ways that we engage in this sort of mass collective parallel exploration of Stuart Kauffman's adjacent possible becomes the thing that is scarce to the economy that's using price to signal relative scarcity, and therefore goes up in value enormously. You know, that's sort of a deer trail into the woods here. But
It's promising woods. I mean, there's the risk of the woods is like dealing with that transition in terms of handling things like unemployment, or even if you could handle people's basic needs that might come from a period of economic transition, still like the emotional and spiritual needs of like if your employment is threatened and your identity and your way of being in the world. But the promise is like a lot of the work we do and some of the jobs that like might fear them taking, to what degree does this free us up for other pursuits that, you know, both in terms of what we do and the way we prepare for it, would let us have more of our humanity. So it's like, you know, our current education system, as I understand it, a lot of it was the function of the Prussian warfare state, and the goal is a mechanization of people in order to allow us to come together for industrial production and contribute to military functioning. And so it's like, so let's say we have systems that can do the more mechanized parts of what we do. Can this then free us up to be educated in different ways and be in the world in different ways? And so what's the existential opportunity there, in addition to risks that we're concerned about? And so then along those lines, how far is it that we can rely on these systems? How much will we be able to rely on them to automate and take over? How much can we outsource? Seems like a good amount, but still an open question. If their world modeling is still lacking in enough coherence, not that ours is perfectly coherent, but if it's still enough of an issue that it's like we can rely on them only so far, and we might even rely on them up until like, it's like self-organization to a catastrophe. It's like we rely on them more and more until finally we get to their limits as we lean on them heavier, and then we reap the whirlwind when they weren't as reliable as we hoped. So that question of how much can we hope to outsource and hand off to them in the coming years? It's the $1 trillion question.
Yes, promoted to the level of their incompetence would seem to be the current answer to that question. But I would like to believe that the kind of thinking that is on display in this issue starts to give us a better handle on how to fund and recruit talent into the development of systems that are actually yielding human and ecological futures that we actually want. And that's where it gets back to this question of like, well, in what way has the linguistic corpus on which we have trained these systems constrained our ability to actually use these systems for something like Eric Beinhocker at Oxford, his definition of like a eudaimonic economy, a much higher dimensional vision of human thriving. So that kind of question links us back into this paper led by Pedros Cividis and Gershman's in this one, Tenenbaum. It's a long author list, but looking at exploring modeling and planning agents and having systems develop world models as they are engaging with video game environments. There's this whole other realm of possibility that we're starting to see some of the most significant voices in AI research say, we need a completely different approach here. This is something Melanie has been advocating for years, that we're not going, in her mind, to develop true generalization and conceptual thought without embodiment. And although you can get into the weeds about whether agents in a video game environment are truly embodied, but there is at least a model for this kind of structured feedback. And so one of the places I would like to point you as we try to land this conversation is in the alternative frameworks and architectures for AI that we may see moving forward. Even if we end up in a kind of LLM winter, there's enough of an updraft now behind all of these other ideas of AI that there are some really interesting, promising things on the horizon. And I'd love to hear you speak to that.
It'll be really interesting to see not just the different contributors to the special issue and the other people who will bring into the conversation, like them describe their own work and their view of the landscape of what's possible with the current systems and what might be possible with other approaches, but also their perspectives on like learning more about the world models underlying these different perspectives, and then what they think is like possible and desirable. And so, like, you're saying, like, there's some people who would be more skeptical of the capabilities of these systems, but who have alternative proposals for things that can maybe bring us to the advances we're hoping for by other means, through other types of potentially more human psychologically and maybe brain-inspired approaches. So the question is, how close are we to getting those systems to be able to be deployed in the world in meaningful ways? And potentially in the world we're in, like, even if there's something like a LLM winter, the amount of investment that's now possible might allow these approaches to make breakthroughs regardless if there's a constriction. But if LLMs to like take less of the air out of the room, there's more room for these alternative approaches to move with greater momentum. And so you have the work of like people in that paper with like Tenenbaum and colleagues of building these sophisticated hybrid systems capable of doing human-like exploration and planning. But also you have people like Jan LeCun, for instance, who like recently like left Meta so he could go all in on building like his JEPA systems, which he says like they're en route to creating something like an artificial cat. And we have to go through these phases of first creating better world modeling systems that work more like us before we can make further advances. He acknowledges that while there's exciting developments, there's years more needed of basic research to be done before they're ready to be deployed in the world. But he still says, like, on the time scale of 5 to 20 years, you could get something like revolutionary systems. And he's able to proceed in starting this company because of all this investment that's gone in. LLMs didn't just take the air out of the room, they also generated capacity for new types of investment that weren't there before. As for how close we are to being able to basically solve the enduring problems of AI and make systems that we can rely on for flexible and robust real-world deployment, I do not know. And that's part of what I'm hoping to have happen with these journal collections and this podcast series we're starting, is to basically get greater clarity on this question by talking to the people driving things forward.
Yeah, I think if we're to TLDR this whole thing, maybe one of the main features that I can extract in my own lossy compression of this conversation is that a lot of this hinges on how do we think about and then how do we enact better exploration in our thinking, in the design of artificially intelligent systems, in our collective intelligence. And I'm really excited that along with all of these excellent people, we have not just our own perverse intrinsic motivation to understand this better, but a very long list of extrinsic motivations to do so, and the extrinsic rewards at this point of doing so, that we've reached a kind of inflection point historically where these things are no longer idle philosophical concerns. They have real tangible implications and consequences for us. When the going gets weird, Hunter S. Thompson said, the weird turn pro. And so here we are. Join us. And I'll let you just ring it out. What are your parting words to folks that are tuned in for the future of this series and possibly interested in contributing in some way or another?
Well, I guess I'm looking forward to getting weird with all of you, and to also getting pro in terms of trying to basically do what we can to generate the best understanding we can muster for what world we think we're in and what we should do about it. And in terms of getting involved, right now we're starting out the series of conversations by focusing on contributors to these special issues and digging into their different world models, and soon world models about agency and the nature of intelligence, and soon alignment. What we're hoping for is this to be an ongoing, evolving conversation, and we're hoping to generate dialogue more generally. So as we proceed, please write in with any ideas you have, if you're interested in supporting this endeavor, but also just your perspectives, and also things like if you think there's people who we should be talking to and who are not, we'd be grateful for suggestions. So that's where I'm at today.
Yeah. And at some point, I know we're going to be hosting salons and roundtables. So obviously, subscribe and thank you. And thank you, Adam. I enjoy every single conversation we have. Real glad to be on this with you.
So glad to be doing this with you. Thank you.
Humans on the Loop is a labor of love. Thanks again for listening, reading, sharing, and supporting this work. More writing and conversations are on the way, including the recording of my talk from DWeb Berlin 2026 on how the study of major evolutionary transitions informs my model of the future of the hybrid human-AI labor market, as well as a recap of Contact in the Desert and how we might rise to the occasion of doing science at the very limit of knowability. I'm also planning a discussion group for Charles Stross's brilliant sci-fi novel Accelerando, which is starting to come true, so it's a perfect time to revisit this book. If you believe that I should have more time for research, horizon scanning, synthesis, and creative communication, become a member at michaelgarfield.substack.com or hire me to help you and your team make better sense of this age of intense transformation. You can also support Humans on the Loop with tax-deductible donations at the link in the show notes. Until next time, remember, resources flow along the channels carved by our attention. Knowing how to aim yours is what separates you from the LLMs. For now.